Think about the last time you watched a high-stakes game of chess. Every move is calculated, not just for the immediate capture, but for the board state 10 moves down the line. Today, we are looking at an institution that plays the ultimate long game, the United States Supreme Court. From explosive rulings on birthright citizenship and trans athletes in sports, to the complex web of campaign finance and the unprecedented challenges of the Trump era, the court is navigating a minefield. But to truly understand what is happening, we have to look past the headlines. We need to treat the court not just as a legal body, but as a strategic actor. What are their actual motives? How do they balance their institutional survival against ideological goals?
It is fascinating because when you analyze the court through a strategic lens, you realize they are operating under a very specific set of mission parameters. If we look at it through a classic strategic framework, what industries call a most analysis, the court's overarching mission is to maintain its role as the ultimate arbiter of the Constitution. But their objectives and strategies are constantly shifting. The current conservative supermajority has a clear strategy to dismantle what they see as administrative overreach and return to a strict originalist interpretation of the text. The tactics, however, are where the real drama lies. They have to decide when to strike down precedent boldly and when to take incremental steps to avoid triggering a massive public backlash.
That balance between boldness and caution is really the core of their institutional dilemma. If they push too hard, they risk their own legitimacy. If they do not push hard enough, they fail their ideological base. It feels like a classic SWOT analysis could help us map this out. What are the internal strengths and weaknesses they are dealing with right now?
Their greatest strength is, without a doubt, their lifetime tenure and constitutional supremacy. Once a decision is handed down, it is the law of the land. But their glaring weakness is a lack of enforcement power. As the old saying goes, the court has neither the sword nor the purse. They rely entirely on the public and the other branches of government to respect their rulings. The moment the public stops believing the court is an impartial referee, that strength evaporates. Right now, their biggest threat is the erosion of public trust, which has hit historic lows. Yet, their opportunity lies in cementing a legal legacy that will shape American society for the next 50 years, regardless of who occupies the White House or controls Congress.
That tension is especially clear when you look at campaign finance. Ever since the Citizens United ruling, the legal landscape has shifted dramatically. If we apply a pestle analysis here, the political and economic forces are incredibly intertwined. Economically, we have seen an unprecedented influx of dark money into elections. Politically, this has polarized the electorate even further. From a legal standpoint, the court has framed this as a pure First Amendment issue, protecting free speech. But socially, the public perceives it as the legalization of political corruption. It shows how a purely legal strategy can create massive social and political friction.
Exactly. And that is where game theory comes into play. Why would the court choose to protect campaign spending so fiercely, knowing it damages their public standing? In game theory, we look at this as a repeated game between the court and Congress. The court wants to limit Congress's ability to regulate political speech because they view legislative restrictions as a slippery slope toward censorship. The payoff for the court is a system where the legislative branch cannot easily silence political opponents. The cost, however, is a loss of public trust. The court has calculated that the long-term payoff of protecting speech, as they define it, outweighs the short-term reputational cost. They are willing to accept the public backlash because they believe they are establishing a stable legal equilibrium.
But that equilibrium feels incredibly fragile when we move to socially charged issues like birthright citizenship. There is a growing push from conservative legal circles to reinterpret the 14th Amendment, arguing that it was never intended to grant citizenship to the children of undocumented immigrants. If the court actually takes this up, the pestle factors go off the charts. The social and legal implications would be seismic, potentially creating a class of stateless people born within US borders.
It would be a monumental shift. From a game theory perspective, the court is playing a game of chicken with the executive branch on this issue. If a future president attempts to end birthright citizenship via executive order, the court will be forced to referee. If they support the president, they risk a massive constitutional crisis and international condemnation. If they strike it down, they alienate their most ardent supporters. The strategic move for the court here is to avoid the issue entirely for as long as possible, denying certiorari to these cases. They want to keep the status quo because any active decision carries a payload of high risk and low reward for their institutional standing.
Speaking of high risk, low reward scenarios, let's talk about the cultural battleground of trans athletes in sports. This is an issue where legal definitions, biology, and social justice collide. The court is being asked to define the scope of Title IX. How do they navigate an issue that is so deeply personal and politically charged?
This is a classic example of the court trying to find a minimax strategy, minimizing the maximum potential damage. On one hand, you have the legal argument of equal protection and non-discrimination based on gender identity. On the other hand, you have the argument of biological fairness and competition. If the court rules too broadly in either direction, they face a massive backlash. If they rule that Title IX protects trans athletes' right to compete in categories matching their gender identity, they face fury from conservative states and athletic organizations. If they rule the opposite, they face intense protests and accusations of bigotry. So, what is their move? They will likely issue a very narrow ruling, focusing on the specific wording of administrative rules rather than making a sweeping constitutional declaration. By keeping the ruling narrow, they shift the burden of the decision back onto local school boards and athletic associations. It is a classic buck-passing strategy to preserve their own capital.
It is fascinating how often the court's best move is to defer, to let other entities take the heat. But before we get into the absolute pressure cooker of the Trump-era challenges and how those decisions are shaping the court's legacy, let's take a quick break to talk about a show that helps make sense of these complex dynamics. If you are enjoying this deep dive, you should definitely check out our partner podcast, The New Sentinel.
The New Sentinel is a podcast dedicated to providing in-depth discussions and deep dives into a wide array of topics. They cover everything from the glitz and glamour of pop culture to the strategic intricacies of military operations.
Each episode is thoughtfully crafted to offer listeners a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, featuring expert interviews, detailed analysis, and engaging storytelling. Whether you are a pop culture enthusiast or someone with a keen interest in global security, The New Sentinel has something for everyone. You can tune in, view, subscribe, comment, and post an inquiry to stay informed and entertained. It is the perfect companion for anyone who loves to look beneath the surface.
It really is. Now, returning to our analysis, let's look at the ultimate test of the court's strategic survival, the Trump-era challenges. We are talking about cases involving presidential immunity, the outer limits of executive power, and ballot eligibility. How does the court handle a figure who actively challenges the norms of the entire system?
When you look at the presidential immunity case, the game theory dynamics are incredibly stark. The court was put in a position where they had to define the limits of executive power for all future presidents, not just one individual. If they ruled that a president has absolute immunity, they essentially rendered the judiciary powerless to check executive overreach in the future. That is a massive loss for the court's own power. But if they ruled that there is zero immunity, they open the door to a cycle of retaliatory prosecutions every time the presidency changes hands, which would destabilize the entire political system.
So they chose a middle path, creating a distinction between official and unofficial acts. In terms of game theory, they established a new Nash equilibrium. They protected the office of the presidency to ensure stability, but they retained the power for the judiciary to decide what constitutes an official act. In doing so, they ensured that the road to defining executive power still runs directly through the Supreme Court. They did not cede their authority. They actually positioned themselves as the permanent arbiters of executive conduct. It was a masterclass in institutional self-preservation, even if it drew fierce criticism from those who wanted a clear-cut condemnation of executive overreach.
It is a brilliant, if controversial, strategic maneuver. But it brings us back to the pestle analysis, specifically the political and social dimensions. By positioning themselves as the ultimate arbiters, they have placed themselves directly in the crosshairs of political warfare. Every single election now becomes a battle for control of the court. The legal system is no longer seen as a separate, neutral arena. It is seen as the primary prize in the political game.
And that brings us to the ultimate question of legacy. When we look at the current court's trajectory, their legacy will not just be defined by the doctrines they establish, like originalism or the major questions doctrine. It will be defined by whether the American public continues to accept their authority. If the court's strategies succeed in cementing a conservative legal framework but fail to maintain public consent, the entire system faces a crisis of legitimacy. We could see future Congresses ignoring rulings, states refusing to enforce decisions, or renewed pushes for court packing. The strategic stakes could not be higher.
It makes you wonder if the court is playing a game that they cannot ultimately win. They are using highly sophisticated, short-term, strategic moves to navigate immediate political crises, but the long-term trend lines show a steady erosion of their foundational asset, public trust. If you lose the trust of the people, no amount of constitutional authority can save you.
That is the ultimate paradox of judicial power. The court is strongest when it appears to be doing the least amount of politics. The moment their strategic calculations become visible to the public, the magic of the black robes begins to fade. They are forced to act like politicians to protect their judicial power. But acting like politicians is precisely what destroys that power. It is a delicate, dangerous tightrope walk, and the entire nation is watching to see if they slip.
It leaves us with a profound question as we look to the future. In a system built on checks and balances, what happens when the referee is no longer seen as neutral, but as the most powerful player on the board? Can the rule of law survive when the law itself is viewed as just another move in the game? We will have to wait and see how the next moves play out on this constitutional chessboard. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.